Right, so welcome again to Slow Food Scotland. Tonight we have a presentation by Bosse Dahlgren. I hope that's the correct pronunciation, Bosse.
Oh, yes.
Just as a little bit of introduction to Bosse, I've listed some of his many qualifications and interests in the information that I put out to tell people about this. I mean, being board members and having awards and various things. But the thing that really stood out for me is not necessarily all of those qualifications and impressive though they all are, but the fact that you're actually a smallholder, a crofter, effectively, a Swedish crofter. And if I think about climate and farming, farming affects climate, which we know, but farming can also, and climate can also affect the way that you farm as well. So there's a very interesting synergy between the practice of farming and its impact on the environment. So that I think gives you an even more special interest in climate. I'm very glad that you're able to be with us tonight and perhaps give us your insights into climate as you see it. Okay, over to you, Bosse.
Yeah, thank you, Walter. I want to say welcome to everybody who's here. Wendy is up here with she's my technician. So thank you, Walter. You're absolutely right. As a farmer, you notice how the climate change and what happenings in nature. I also have a newspaper, farming newspaper from 1879 and up to 1980. So you can see that this little ice age that was earlier was quite difficult. We don't want it back, believe me. I heard my grandparents talk about it and so on. So we should, in a way, up in the north, we should be happy if we can get a few degrees warmer. And to start the whole thing, I want to go back to China in the 60s when Mao Zedong was in charge and was going to put China into more modern times and to produce more food. So Mao said in the early 60s that the house sparrows was behind the famine in China that had made about 100 million Chinese starve to death. But if they made the sparrows extinct, they would be both fed and happy. Well, he failed in getting the sparrows extinct, and he wanted to say that nothing to do with politics. And now we're there again. Well, if we only make the cows extinct, there will be no climate change. And then you think, is there anybody with a brain who believes that the methane gas from the cows and sheep are the problem? While the American Energy Authorities, called EIA, says that the cow stands for 3% of the methane emission, and fossil oil and gas production stands for 97%. There's something to think. This is in America, but I think we have something to think about there. On the other hand, methane gas from animals and from land is a gas that goes around, is up for a short time, and then it goes back into the system again. So nothing has happened for the last million years with the methane gas that not comes from fossil fuels or getting the both oil and gas out of the ground. So what's the problem? When I went to agriculture college, I was taught that we need about 400 ppm of CO2 to get a good harvest and make every plant happy. They were even talking about in the 60s making enormous greenhouses where we can have the grain, so we get enough to feed the population. Today, they pump in carbon dioxide in greenhouses to get a better harvest from tomatoes and cucumbers. Something to think about. We humans can't go in there because from my own experience, some people I know have died of standing inside when the carbon dioxide level gets too high. But we're now talking of several thousand ppm. Carbon, it's a major fertilizer for the plants. Without carbon, no life. We get it in through eating plants, eating animals who've been eating plants. And the plants get it in by breathing. And when they breathe this, they let out the extra oxygen, which helps us to breathe easier. So therefore, because it's a major fertilizer, therefore the only way is to breathe it in. That shows why we need that high part per million of carbon dioxide. Of all the gases in the air, carbon dioxide is 0.04%, which is quite interesting too. So if we're going to feed the population we have today, we need this a bit over 400 part per million of carbon dioxide. So in around year 2000, 500 universities were counting on this, how many people we can feed on the planet. And the result was about 12 billion people. But if we go down the road that the politicians want, then quite a few billion will die. We can't feed that many that we are today. Before the politicians end our life, I want to say that carbon is essential for all life, as well as ours. So it's all living creature on the planet needs carbon. And what happens if we stop the process of carbon emission? How do we stop it? If it gets too low, how do we stop ourselves and the planet to die out? Because we can't stop this lowering procedure that's going on. Because it's so easy to start a war, but it's very difficult to stop it. And it's the same with the carbon. We can probably get the levels down. But when we know from nature, where something starts, nature goes on and on. So therefore, I'm a little bit scared about the whole thing. So by the way, I can say that 1 kilo carbon have the amount of 10,000 calories. And that shows why it's so important to get the carbon back into the soil, because that will feed the microlife we have in the soil. So I'm now going to show you some graphs. This was a little introduction to hopefully understand the graphs. And here I must thank because I use graphs from other people, scientists. So therefore, I have to thank these who helped me and gave me the input to this speak tonight. So it's Polar Portal, the Danish government about the climate on Greenland, which is quite interesting. Elsa Widding, professor at Chalmers University, who educates civil engineers. William Happer from Princeton, professor at Princeton University, physicist. William Wingarden, York University in Canada, and Lennart Bengtsson, who is Swede, by accident from the same place that I am from, but he's 10 years older than me. And he's a professor at Max Planck University in Hamburg. And he's also professor at Reading in England. And he's seen as the most knowledgeable person in Europe right now when it comes to climate matter. So here we start. I go through these little things here. Here, this is John Tyndall, 1859, when he tried to split up the CO2 from the H2O, that's water, because when it comes to climate change, so the clouds is the most driving when it comes to heat up. We can say this, that the sun lets down around 340 watt per square meter on the planet. And then most of it goes up. So about 1 watt is what we get left per square meter, is what we get left on the planet. The rest goes back out in the universe. And when the clouds take over, it stays, the heat stays more. So we get a warmer climate. And with a warmer climate, more moist. So it's like a self-playing piano. So John Tyndall was the first to see how this worked. Here we have a graph from, it's from Greenland. And it's about the warm periods when the ice melted. It's quite interesting because it has worse than it is today, and there's been less ice. The glaciers in Norway were gone about 6,000 years ago. There was no glaciers in Norway. And on Greenland, there were much less. I don't know if you can see the end of this graph. I can't, unfortunately, not see it. But we are, today, we are on that line you see there. There's a black line going right over. And we are at that one. So we are not even up to the historical figures. Oh, a bit quick. Here is another one. And here you can, the Greenland again. And you can see the Minoan warming, the Minoan culture, you know, with the jumping over the bulls. And then you have the Roman warming during the Roman times. The Roman era disappeared. You can see the weather gets colder. And because they couldn't feed the troops with grain. Grain was very easy to transport. Animals were more difficult. And then we have a little heat wave, say from Viking Age or up to late medieval time. And then we goes into what we call the Little Ice Age. And I think it's there. They want back to the Little Ice Age today. And Scotland would not do too well. If you go down 2 degrees, it will be a nightmare, believe me. I've heard the old people talk about it, and I've seen the result from it. Hard winters, short summer, things give a very little yield. And it was People were struggling. And here we have, this is a global warming models. It's a IPCC first, is a red line, what they did in the first reports. And you can see in red text that the hypothesis failed. So it's reacted today, that goes for the lower one with 0.5 degrees. So we are a little bit, yeah, what shall we say? 0.6, 0.7. So this scaring isn't really correct. It's quite interesting when you read the IPCC reports. You don't find anything about the cows and the methane gas. So you don't find anything, not eating meat, not drinking milk, and this. I couldn't find it. But the thing is, the report they give to the politicians and the newspaper is a bit different from what they write in their own report. Totally different. And here we have the red line is when these plants, C3 plants, it's a grain. When they don't survive, when we can't get any grain. And you can see the level of carbon dioxide, how many ppm they've been, and you can see the years. Sorry. How many years we go back in time. So we go back millions of years in time. And we are down, we are quite close. So going down too much is not really an option. Here you can see rice. Here is up to 800 ppm. Rice favorite is 1000 ppm, the carbon dioxide. And below you have wheat. And the wheat can go much further down than our grain can do. Wheat and oat and barley, rye, they want a bit over 400 ppm to thrive, where we are today. Here we have Bumblebee. We hear about the Extinction rebellion, say everything, every life will disappear, all will go. This is bee beetles taken on our meadow. This picture, when they took that in our meadow in Sweden, our natural meadow. And we have a lot of them. They are very beautiful, very cute. And the same with the fritillaria, which I try to get back to Britain. They import butterflies. And the same with the bumblebee beside the fritillaria. Another picture from the meadow. This is wild marjoram they are sitting on. They love that. So it's not the climate change. It's our way of farming that make this animal extinct. We must realize we are doing things the wrong way. We can't spray everything. We have our croft in a place which is backwater in Sweden, lot of big rocks and things. You can't do big scale farming. Therefore, these animals and plants, they still live there. Other places in Sweden where the big plains, where the big scale farming, they are extinct. So we must go down in smaller scale farming. Food production. Here we have our CO2 have fertilized the planet. It's quite interesting. You can see bits that are red. You can even see bits that are red in Africa. It's where they cut down the forest too much. And you have South America, Amazonas don't do too well. And then you have the desert in Australia, they don't do well too. But then you have up in the north, if you see, there is minus about 10% of the plants. And that has to do with colder climate. So the last years, the climate is getting a bit colder in the northern hemisphere. But unfortunately, talk about the equator, but we live up here in the north, and I think we want to eat and live too. And here we have climate-related death, which is quite interesting. And the headline is, instead of scaring kids witless, maybe we should show them this, is how the death, depending on climate, has gone down. So, and this is quite fascinating because I talk about extinction of humans, extinction of animals, and it has nothing to do with that. It has, but I'm throwing in a little note here that this is from a natural meadow that's been there, since 1,000 years back in time. It was fertilized, bits of it was fertilized about a little bit more than 100 years ago, and you still can see the dandelions there. But otherwise, there's about 40 different plants per square meter, most of them flowers. But the grass take over a little bit more every year. And that has to do with nitrous gas and the higher level of carbon dioxide. Because the grass, it benefits from this. Nitrous gas, I should perhaps talk about another, but that's a climate gas as well. And that's driving the climate worse than the cows are. Because it comes out from when you fertilize land with nitrogen. You buy these bags with nitrogen and put out quite a lot of it per hectare. A lot of it goes up in the air and get nitrous gas. One of the worst crops we have is lettuce, which is quite interesting. So the vegans are not right about that. So when I make a sum of all this, it's not easy to say anything about, because most of this ecosystem and the climate and everything is very complicated, and there are many factors involved in it. So you can't say it's not black and white. This will kill us, this will save us. But I think we should be a little bit more relaxed about the whole thing and focus on the right thing. For example, we hear about if we get more technique, we can solve the problem. If we get more artificial intelligence, we can solve the problem. I could have another speech about that, because that is a dead end, wherever we want it or not. GMO, for example, and today it's so popular with this genetic scissor, got a Nobel Prize for it. But we have seen that land races, both plants and animals, are adaptive to the climate change. And the climate do change. It changes all the time, all directions. Of course, we affect the climate change. We do that. But it takes 10 generations for plants. That means for grain, 10 years land races, and you're back on the street again. And so they follow when the climate change. And for animals who have a change generation, change in 1 year, it takes 10 years. Cows, I tried it myself, it takes about 20 to 30 years. While these GMO, they are static, they don't change. So therefore, they are quite dangerous in a way. So like I said earlier, I haven't talked about nitrous gas that comes from burning, but I haven't talked about spraying crops, compacting soils that kills or all microlife. I haven't talked about tarmac on the land, concrete, building on wrong land. That, but don't worry about it, because we can always blame it on the climate. Angela Merkel did that. You heard about the flooding in Germany, where tragically few people were killed, they drowned. And there was an investigation done. So they put together a bunch of people who investigated what it was. And they came to the result, there was too much concrete, too much tarmac, too much building on the wrong kind of land. And because we compact the land, the water won't go down in the soil. But she quickly as hell came out with it was a climate. So that's me for tonight. Thank you. So now, if you have questions, you're very welcome.
I've got a question. I mean, I was going to talk about the evidence that appears to be piling up, or at least gets put in front of us, which suggests that we're getting seriously bad effects of climate change. You've suggested that the floods are perhaps not directly associated with the climate change, but we have seen a number of instances across the world of much higher temperatures than we are used to. Maybe not as high as some of the peaks that we've seen in the far past, in many thousands of years back. But do you think that for example, the fires in Australia and in California, and the extremely high temperatures in Canada, do you think these are as a result of a definite change in the climate, or is this just the beginning of a peak which will then go back down to whatever normality is?
If I had gone back a few years there with these graphs, you can see in the 1920s, 1930s, the temperature was much higher in both Canada and America.
Yeah.
And the fires is we have changed the use of land. In Australia, the Aborigines have warned for I don't know how many years that they don't burn the grass. So, and said this will not go well. But these environmentalists said, no, we are not going to burn any grass. We have the same, this not use any land. I have a good example of this in Sweden, where 2018, we had a very dry summer. We had enormous forest fires. Mm-hmm. And from my own experience and the two generations before me was we have changed the use of the forest. The animals, the cows used to go out in the forest grazing. Mm-hmm. Twigs, branches were picked up by people because they used them as fuels. Like in Scotland, you had the right to put up branches and twigs from the land. And the animals trampled down because I have myself burnt quite a lot of land. We let the rush take over. Mm-hmm. We destroy land in every possible way we can. And I don't know, I can talk about this for a long time, but when it comes to flooding and compacting land, let me see, I don't have it totally clear the name of the part who did investigation. But I think Oxford University was the one who put it together. They have investigated what the little microlife in the soil do. Mm. They make tunnels. And I have film of it. And You know, you have to be a nerd to see these tunnels they're filming in. Not Glasgow University is another group in Glasgow that have shown how these small tunnels, they are the thickness of one of your hair.
Mhm.
And it lets water down when it's raining a lot, brings water up when it's dry. And with big tractors, we are destroying these tunnels. We are compacting the land. I've tried out with heavy horses and got an increase of the harvest of 25% by using horses. Not extra fertilizer, not spraying anything, just using horses.
Okay.
And that has to do with the compacting. And now I got the answer of that, because the little tunnels the bacteria do in the soil. In the soil, we also have bacteria like Azotobacter and cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria in the sea is, people with dogs know that dogs can die from them. They are poisonous. But on the land, they bring down nitrogen from the air. So with these bacteria and planting peas and beans, for example, which only can plant every 7 years, you can get about almost up to 100 kilo nitrogen into the soil without putting on artificial nitrogen. So you can get very good harvest. So the Victorians brought this to life, and these who had heavy horses used this in Sweden up to the 70s. And in those days, I got about 6 ton winter wheat per hectare, while the harvest was about 5-6 ton per hectare for these who used the average way. With clover, I have got 20 ton per hectare of dry matters, with no spraying there too, no artificial fertilizer. I tried out, we were raking up quite a lot of leaves, so I plowed down the leaves direct, not composting them. And first year we harvested, we got 20 tons. Then I topped it up with some composted manure and got 20 tons again after 2 years. So, and you know, if you're going to have 20 tons dry matter with ryegrass, you don't do this with white clover, because you won't get that harvest with that. But it shows that when you do organic farming, there's so many lies about it. We can't feed the planet. But back to this with the carbon back in the soil. It's now we have the chance to do this, because when we reach peak oil, peak gas, which we already reached, peak coal is about 2050, then we can't top up the ppm, we can't go up that high that we can do now. So what we should do now is to get back the soils to where they once were. The American prairie was the buffaloes, 200 million buffaloes was fertilized. And they were also into California, the forest, and on the East Coast when they were at the top. Then the white men start to kill them off. So when the big slaughter there was about 100 million, 120 million left of them. And they, of course, they changed the land, and the Indians, or First Nation, I should call them, they burned the land then you fertilize it with the ash. So it got a lot of grass for the buffaloes, because they were living on the buffaloes. So And then, what shall we say in this? That we hear so much about humans shouldn't interfere in the biological systems. We are part of the biological system. We are part of the environment. So, and you saw the bee beetles and you saw the fritillaria butterfly there, and if we wasn't cutting the grass, give it to animals, and then you can fertilize other parts. So it can be the engine of a farm. But if we didn't cut the grass, you wouldn't have that rich biodiversity we have there. So, and some scientists call it rainforest of the north. This with cows grazing in the forest. It's quite interesting because CBM is a center for biodiversity in Sweden. Because we have this with summer farms in the forest, you take the animals out, go grazing. There are not many left of this. I think it's about under 100 farms still do this. But the cows benefit about 2,500 species, of which 1,875 are up on the red list. So, and everybody says wolves are good for the biodiversity. I don't want all wolves extinct. It's not about that, but it is a benefit about 11 species. And they would have been benefited by bears or wolverines or lynx. Mm-hmm. So therefore, we have lost this proportion for nature. We lost the proportion for how the system works. So Leonard Bengtsson, he talked about the sea because we're talking about the sea level. When the sea gets warmer, it will swollen up, so it expands. And I'm not going into, but I have he was counting on it. And he said, to make the sea level go up 1 degree, today the sea temperature. The sea temperature today is an average of 3.5 degrees Celsius. If you want it up to 4.5 degrees Celsius, it takes 400 years. And Polar Portal, which I talked about here earlier, I want people to go in and have a look at it. The ice, inland ice on Greenland is growing again. It has grown with several cubic kilometers. It's 3,000 meters thick. And because the climate has gone up around 1 degrees, I think some says 1.2 degrees warmer the last 200 years, means that you get more, what you call it, not rain, you get snow, more snow on the inland ice on Greenland, and it grows from the snow. This summer I saw a picture of how the water was running off. That was because it came a heavy rain when there was a few heat wave with a few days of hot weather, but after that it was freezing again. So you get more ice, compact ice of it instead.
Mm-hmm. But there appears to be evidence, for example, in Siberia about the land there gradually, the tundra that they've got there that is mostly frozen is now starting to melt and is also releasing methane into the atmosphere. Is that contradicting what's happening in Greenland?
No, that doesn't affect Greenland in any way, because Greenland is in 2016, the temperature is going down and the ice loss have diminished. Mm-hmm. Well, but this you mentioned with the methane gas is very interesting, because they can't find any sign of when the mammoth was grazing up there. The flora was totally different. it was more of sedge than it is today. And there was no methane gas down in it. And they are now shaking their heads. They can't explain why. We have methane gas today, but not when the climate was much warmer. So that's another thing that still have to be investigated. So we don't have answer to everything, but we can fly to the moon.
Everything that you've said about the advantages of returning to smaller scale farming, to regenerative farming, and all of those things, I completely understand and completely agree with. But there does seem to be such a volume of protest about the way that global temperatures appear to be rising, and you're implying quite strongly that we shouldn't be as worried about that as we appear to be, which kind of makes you a bit of a climate denier, if you see what I mean.
No, I'm not a climate denier. I'm not, because the pollution must stop.
Right, yes, okay.
I totally agree with that.
Right, okay.
The pollution must stop. What I want to stop is this hysterical stupidity that's going on. So it's absolutely right. And we blame the cows for things. Yet we are building cities with concrete. And there was a time when you made the artificial fertilizer, the nitrogen there, with hydropower. Today you use it with fossil gas.
Yeah.
So so when the vegans say so good for the climate to eat vegetarian, it's not, it's the opposite.
Agreed.
You left out gases, much more gases than the cows ever can do.
Yeah. And
like you saw from Tyndall's there, the nitrous gas, it's not that potent that the methane. The problem is it's a little bit less potent, but much more potent than CO2. CO2 is not the problem, because CO2, it's quite funny, I'll tell you about that, but there's so much of the nitrous gas. So it's much more of the nitrous gas than it is of the methane from the cows. So that it's back to Mao Zedong with his sparrows. I remember my mom, she laughed like hell when she heard that. So the Chinese had to go out when they saw sparrow to clap their hands. They wasn't allowed to sit down, so they were going to scare them to death. It didn't work. And they were starving up to the 90s, when they start to be able to get the economy going so they could import food. Today, they have learned their lessons, so they have better methods to farming, but they are still a bunch of maniacs. Okay. So they it's quite fun. I have a friend who was setting up the biggest dairy farm in the world in China. Not farm, sorry, the biggest dairy in the world. Right. Because the Chinese wanted the IQ, Chinese government wanted the IQ to go up on Chinese children, and found out to make the IQ go up on children, they need whole milk. It's a fat in the milk. And they managed. So children under 12 have to drink 125 milliliter per day. Children over 12 have to drink 175 milliliter per day. But the thing is, suddenly they need cows. So in the big cities, on the backyard, on these big houses, you could see 40 dairy cows. And they imported hay from California to feed them.
Not the ideal way, is it?
No, it's not exactly environmental in any way. So I mean, but where there is a will, there is a way. But I saw a guy from England. I totally forgot his name. If I remember, it could be Sims, who've been counting on this because we have a problem we never talk about that is more serious, and that's solar storms.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the eruption from the sun, yeah, which can cut down internet, all electricity, and mobile phones and everything. So therefore, it's he recommended to go back to small-scale farming where you can use less advanced tools. Mm-hmm. So he recommended 13% of the British population should work with farming that wasn't that advanced, which it didn't use artificial intelligence and drones and all. Yeah. Okay. Oh, here a guy, we've been looking at historic NDVI on forests in Europe. The forests are basically dying. Yields in key grain growing areas are dropping. I'm sorry, Paul, but the grain, key grain is not dropping. It has, I had a graph which I dropped about how the grain has gone, and it's 10 doubled from what it was 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah, okay, so I'll jump in here.
Yes.
So my role, that I'm sort of a bit of an imposter here. Okay, I'm actually the weather company's agriculture specialist in Europe, and I was very keen to see what this conversation was going to be about. But we are seeing across the board yield reductions across every key farming area in Europe, including in places like Ukraine and so forth, which is a big breadbasket. Seeing exactly the same thing in Australia. It's so a lot of what we're saying here is in fact that there's soil acidification going on, because one of the things that happens when you get too much carbon in the or carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is it actually ends up lodging itself in the soil and actually becoming acidic. So we're looking at soils coming down to about a pH of about 5.5. That's very, very bad for anything that actually wants to try and grow in that. And we're seeing exactly the same thing in the oceans as well, because that's another place that captures a lot of it. But rather than capturing, it's actually making it acidic. It's a major problem. And so, you know, I could show you some very, very interesting things around. Like I say, we have historic NDVI going back for a couple of decades, and I've got a student at the moment who's actually looking at it, and we're looking at the complete ungreening of Europe. It's actually frightening, and that is because the climate is changing in a way that we have no control over. Anyway, I'll stop there.
We had a big death about what is it now? Is it 4,000 years ago on elm trees? They almost died out, and we have now fungus, different fungus attacked trees. We have all the trees and ash trees and even what you call them, horse chestnuts. Mm-hmm. So there is a death of trees. We have seen oak trees that don't feel too well. So I was witnessing a meeting where they talked about the oak trees in Europe and found out that these countries where the oak trees were growing, where you had the animals grazing, did quite well, while the where you let the land be, where the oak trees were, they didn't do too well. And I know from my own experience that the oak are not good at fighting with other trees. So sometimes they want too many trees on too small area. When it comes to grain, it's quite interesting with you saying there that it's going down the pH. And 5.5, rye goes well on 5.5, oat goes well on 5.5. What you can't grow is wheat. You can grow it, but it gives a much smaller yield. It's wheat and barley. And I never put lime on my land. And I kept the pH up with only manure. It was composted manure. If you put down slurry, the pH go down. And artificial fertilizers, the pH go down. We know that, and we know that for a long, long time. So, but I never heard that the carbon dioxide makes the pH go down. Can you explain that, Paul? It would be interesting.
Yeah, look, I can't on the context of this call. It's the science is too complicated, but it is actually it's well accepted that this is actually what's happening. The soil is actually sequestering the carbon, and it is turning into, and I'll have to remember what the name of I think it's carbonic acid, which is ending up in the soil and making it very, very difficult to actually grow grain crops. You can grow trees on it, but you can't grow grain crops. And as I say, we've been, the next study that we're about to do is to look at historic NDVI across the grain growing areas of southeastern Australia. Our contention is that yields are going down over the years. And this is interesting because it's exactly where I grew up.
Yeah.
And so as a result, we actually think by studying fundamentally the crop health over several decades, that we'll actually start to see things that are actually dropping off. And I can tell you, so in a previous life, I used to be the weighbridge operator at a clearing station up in northwestern Victoria.
Yeah.
Even back in the late 80s and early 90s, where I was doing that job as a holiday job, we were watching yields dropping off year by year. We were staying open less time. The amount of grain that farmers were bringing in was already starting to drop. It's a fascinating arena. I'm not going to say I've got all the answers. In fact, I can even say I may not even have any of the answers. But it's a compelling thing to actually go look at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I want to be a bit boring here and say that the farming methods, we are too intensive in the farming methods. I tried out different farming methods, and I have taken over, let's see, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 farms that have been done the modern way, and put it back to where you used animals on the land. So you have a rotational system where you get manure out. I used the horses, and the horses was very interesting because people think horses back to 1800. Today, with ground-driven hydraulic pumps, you don't need to lift heavy things. You pump up the pressure which you use to lift things. So we can use modern technique and use our brain to find out other ways. But of course, the problem is that nobody makes money on it. And where I've seen the same, and I saw the same already in the 30s. When I went to agriculture college in the 60s, we got science from the 30s, and a lot of land in Sweden at that time were done by horses, but the tractors took over more and more, and they saw what happened to the soil. The soil didn't do too well, but they compensated with putting on more artificial fertilizer. And so have we done that over the years. And I too have seen the yields go down. And that's what I was talking about earlier here. I also seen the pH go down, because I can't explain why the pH keeps up when you use manure, but I never need any limestone, believe me, 6.5 pH. Mm-hmm. And other people tried this with the horses and came to the same result. So it's not only me.
Right. I think we're probably at the end of the time slot that we've got just now. I mean, we don't have to cut off hard and fast if we don't want to, but I think we've probably reached a natural end point here anyway. It's good to have maybe just a wee bit of controversy there at the end. It's nice to see ideas flowing between potentially maybe not completely opposite viewpoints, because there is some significant synergy between what you were both saying. But anyway, it's very useful, Bosse, to get a view which isn't the same as the views that we get from the sound bites from the journalists and the media, and people may very well disagree to some extent with what you're saying. I completely agree with a lot of it. I'm a bit more open about whether or not I should be worried about the climate, the temperatures rising, for example. I certainly agree with you about pollution. It really has to come down hugely. But the thing that I support most, I guess, is going back to traditional methods and trying to get away from intensive farming, where you're really going against what nature, the way that human beings evolved with the landscape before we got to the point where we would just throw fertilizer at things to try and overcome some of the deficiencies of the farming techniques as we got bigger and bigger farms. So anyway, thanks to everybody for joining us, and especially, of course, thanks to you, Bosse, because as I say, it's clear that you've got a passion about trying to find the real answers to things, and also to correct some of the perhaps potentially misleading sound bites that we do here. So just as a reminder to everybody, this will be recorded, and if you know anybody else who hasn't been able to make it tonight and would like to understand a little bit more about what we've been saying, it will be on the Slow Food UK YouTube channel. There are another couple of sessions coming up round about the Terra Madre Day. And certainly Slow Food Scotland hopes to participate in the Terra Madre Day. I think it might be over the weekend there. It's not been quite finalised, but we certainly will have a couple of slots there. One of which I'm hoping to be talking about East Ayrshire Council, where one of our very exceptional farmers in Moscow, where they're providing the milk for the schools there, and I'm expecting the intelligence quotient of all of the East Ayrshire children to become noticeably better over time. And hopefully I will have somebody from the council talking there, as well as Bryce from Mosgiel, and also Lochinvar, who are providing some of the other food for the children there. So it's an interesting little area, and I'm hoping that we'll get appropriate support for that. Okay. Well, thanks again, Bosse. Thanks everybody else.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bosse.
Thank you.
And Wendy
Thank you.
behind the scenes.
And thank you, Paul, for good questions.
Sure, that's very
Plenty
good.
more. I think we're running out of time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everyone.
Good evening. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.